Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of this two-part video on the ontological argument for God's existence, wherein we will be responding to 10 YouTube objections to the argument. I highly recommend that you watch the first part before coming here because the ontological argument that I have presented in part 1 is my own modification of Plantinga's version of the argument, and I'll be using that to refute the objections in this video. The link to part 1 is in the description below. Just a word of announcement, my new book on the problem of evil is available on the Amazon Kindle store and is currently ranking top 5 among Amazon's bestsellers under Christianity. The link to my book is given in the description below, so if you're interested in fresh insights to the philosophical problem of evil, then I'd recommend that you check that out. Let's look at the first objection to the ontological argument. Objection 1. The concept of an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being is logically impossible. And to that, the objector says, can God create a stone too heavy that he himself cannot lift? See, this question is asked to show an internal inconsistency in the attribute of omnipotence. If God is infinite in power, then he should be able to create a stone too heavy for him to lift. But if he creates such a stone that he himself cannot lift, then he has no infinite power. So omnipotence is a logically incoherent concept. In response to that, we have to define what omnipotence is. Omnipotence does not mean infinite power. Omnipotence means the ability to do all that is logically possible. And the above said task is a logically impossible task. And so even omnipotence cannot do such logically impossible tasks. The second part of the objection is that omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence have no maximal intrinsic value since they are infinite. Here again, they do have maximal values, that is, they do have an upper limit. For example, omnipotence means that God can do any task that is logically possible. So that is the upper limit. God cannot do any task that is logically impossible. And what about omniscience? Omniscience means that God knows all that is there to know. That is the limit. There is nothing for God to not know. So we have a limit there. Likewise, omnibenevolence means that God is perfectly loving and good. See, these are not infinite terms. These are clearly definable and they do have an upper limit. The second objection is that the objector was saying that you are defining God into existence because God by definition is a being that exists is what you say, and then from that you say that therefore God exists. And they point to premise 1, which says that a maximally great being is defined as an all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect being existing in every CHB world. So in the definition itself, we have existence as part of the definition. So that is the objection. In response, I would say that we are not defining God into existence. We are just defining God as a being who, if he exists, should exist in every CHB world. For example, to prove or disprove whether unicorns exist, we have to first define a unicorn as a contingently existing horse-like animal with a single horn. And then we'll have to decide whether such a unicorn exists or not. See, we are not acknowledging the actual existence of such a unicorn by this definition. We are just saying that if a unicorn exists, then it should exist like so and so. Objection 3. Existence is not an attribute, one YouTuber had said. Existence is not a great-making property, and one more had said. Necessity is not a great-making property. In response, we are not trying to show that existence is greater than non-existence. What we are trying to show is that when compared to contingent existence, necessary existence is a great-making property. A contingently existing being requires something else for its existence. By contrast, a necessary existence would mean that the being exists by its very nature and doesn't require something else for its existence. Hence, necessity is a great-making property. Now keep in mind that although existence is not a property, The type of existence, either necessity or contingency, is a property that all existing beings would have. Objection 4. How do we know what great making properties are? One YouTuber had said that you're simply saying that a property is great making insofar as they are the properties of God. So you're simply assuming God's properties to be great making properties. Well, to answer this objection, we have to go back to a definition of a maximally great being. A maximally great being is an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being existing in every CHB world. Again, how do we know what great-making properties are? Simple, by intuition. You see, it is intuitively obvious that greater strength, greater morality, greater knowledge, and necessary existence are all great-making properties. Objection 5. How can a maximally great being exist only in some possible worlds and then move on to all possible worlds, referring to Alvin Plantinga's version of the argument? Again, get back to our definition of an MGB. MGB is an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being existing in all CHB worlds. If an MGB exists even in one metaphysically possible world, then it has to, by definition, exist in all CHB worlds. If MGB doesn't exist even in one metaphysically possible world, then it shouldn't exist in any CHB world. And to show that an MGB doesn't exist even in one metaphysically possible world, then the arguer will have to show that the concept of an MGB is logically incoherent. That would be considered as a defeater for premise 2 of my modification of the ontological argument. Objection 6. We can define anything into existence by this way. Let's say that a maximally great island, a maximally great pizza, or a maximally great lion exists. And so let's take the first example, a maximally great island. 3 questions that we'll have to ask. Number 1, does a maximally great island have any intrinsic maximal value? In other words, how many trees should a maximally great island have in order to be maximally great? It would differ from person to person. There's no intuitively obvious upper limit to that question. Second, does a maximally great island have any objective maximal values? Ask yourself this question, which is greater, an island which is calm and peaceful, or an island where there is much partying and enjoyment, or something in between? Again, the answer will differ from person to person. Third, can this maximally great island exist in every CHB world? Imagine a CHB world wherein the universe exists as a singularity, like a small dot. Can a physical island possibly exist in such a singularity? No. So a maximally great island is a logically incoherent concept. Second, a maximally great pizza. We can ask the same 3 questions. How many ingredients added would qualify for a maximal greatness of that pizza? No definite answer. Which is greater, vegetarian pizza or non-vegetarian pizza? No definite answer. And imagine a world, CHB world, where the pizza is completely eaten. Now the pizza doesn't even exist in the CHB world and therefore cannot be maximally great, since it now won't exist in every CHB world. You see the problem with parodies. Let's look at the third parody, a maximally great lion. Can a maximally great lion exist in a CHB world where the universe did not exist? For a lion to be a lion, it has to be physical and hence occupy space. But suppose there is no space or physicality, which is a CHB world, then could a physical lion be actualized in such a description of reality? No, it can't. So a maximally great lion cannot exist in every CHB world and hence cannot be maximally great. Objection number 7. You can reverse the ontological argument and prove that God does not exist. Let's say premise 1, it is metaphysically possible that MGB does not exist. 2, if it is metaphysically possible that MGB does not exist, then MGB does not exist in at least one CHB world. And then the argument will follow the same principle. What I would like to say is that the first premise, that it is metaphysically possible that MGB does not exist, this first premise will be true only if the concept of MGB is logically incoherent. As long as MGB is a logically coherent concept, then it will always be metaphysically possible for MGB to exist. So to show that it is metaphysically possible for MGB to not exist, the arguer will actually have to show that the concept of an MGB is logically incoherent. Objection number 8. Some logically possible worlds contradict the existence of God. Well, in response to that, that is actually true. For example, a world where God and only suffering exist is a logically possible world because it involves no self-contradiction, but it is metaphysically impossible in that it cannot be actualized. Why can't it be actualized? Because a morally perfect being, if it existed, would not allow a world where only suffering existed. Hence, not all logically possible worlds would be CHB worlds. And for the ontological argument to succeed, we should be able to show only that God could exist in all CHB worlds and not all logically possible worlds. If you want to know what I mean by CHB worlds or logically possible worlds, suppose you're watching the video just now, please go back to part 1 of the video where I have explained all my terms. Objection number 9. The maximally worst being argument. Let's see how the argument works. 1. It is metaphysically possible that a maximally worst being exists. 2. If a maximally worst being is metaphysically possible, then it exists in at least one CHB world. 3. If it exists in one CHB world, it exists in all CHB world. 4. If it exists in all CHB worlds, it exists in the actual world. Therefore, maximally worst being exists. Now, in response to this, consider what a maximally worst being is. For a maximally worst being to exist, it must exist as maximally worst in every CHB world. As such, it must have all the worst-making properties. In particular, it must be maximally impotent, maximally ignorant, and morally evil in every CHB world. But think about it, if a being is maximally powerless and impotent and ignorant, doesn't know anything, then how can it create any world? But our world exists. Our world in all its grandeur and glory exists. Hence, a maximally worst being cannot exist. Objection number 10. The arguer says that this is purely a game of thought and doesn't really reflect reality. You brought God into reality just by some logical thinking. Well, in response, it is true that the ontological argument is an exercise in modal logic. There's no positive evidence that can be given for its key premise, that is, it is metaphysically possible that MGB exists. We can't give any scientific or any analytical evidence for this key premise. Of course, to support this possibility, we could give other arguments like the Kalam cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the axiological argument, the contingency argument, and so forth. But the ontological argument is unique in that it appeals to your intuition in saying that if you think that the concept of God as a maximally great being is even remotely possible, then it follows by the canons of logic that God exists. So it is up to you to decide whether the concept of God is logically and metaphysically possible or not. If yes, then by logic, it reaches the conclusion that God exists. This is the ontological argument, and I believe that this argument is still sound and valid, and the way in which I have modified it wins.